Righto, welcome to the Bogan Bulletin. Smash that like button and grab a beer, because today we are talking about freedom, fair dinkum.
On 88streams.com.
All right, let's jump right into a seriously fascinating and deeply polarizing case study in modern Australian hip-hop. Today, we're looking at the intricate web of Filthy, a self-proclaimed master wordsmith who uses his music to conduct aggressive forensic audits of the Australian state. Now, what makes this explainer incredibly unique is that the subject himself actually left behind a highly specific blueprint in his dossiers. He explicitly demanded how he wanted this story deconstructed, literally asking for the skeletons to be dragged right out of the closet. So, acting as an impartial lens, we're going to look objectively at the facts, the files, and the music to unpack the man, the myth, and the method.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. First up, Aussie battle rap origins. Second, the Rue Digger persona. Third, a strict sonic blueprint. Fourth, the systemic audit. Fifth, the clinical dossier. And finally, artistic resistance.
All right, part 1, Aussie battle rap origins.
To really understand Filthy, we have to start exactly where he cut his teeth. The raw, confrontational world of the Melbourne one-ounce underground battle rap circuit. This isn't your polished, mainstream music, you know. It's aggressive, face-to-face lyrical combat. If we look at the broader context of Australian hip-hop, the scene actually traces its origins back to the early 1980s, initially inspired by American culture. But as it matured, it developed this distinctly Australian personality. It transformed from the creative underground into a really powerful platform for diverse, often marginalized voices to speak their truth. And this gritty, unfiltered environment, it provided the absolute perfect incubator for the confrontational style our subject would later completely.
Moving on to part 2, the Rue Digger persona and character engineering. Emerging from those battle rap trenches, the artist fully conceptualized his new identity, the Rue Digger. This persona is built on absolute intimidation and unyielding confidence. Identifying as a 6'5" god, he positions himself as part Ned Kelly, part high-level forensic auditor. Ideologically, he presents himself as an unapologetic Aussie nationalist who harbors a deep, systemic distrust for government agencies. And look, this isn't just some casual aesthetic. It's a heavily armored persona designed specifically to command space and challenge authority head-on.
But a persona needs a unique voice, right? Filthy describes his signature lyrical technique as double tendres. This is his own adaptation of double entendres, basically layering multiple meanings into heavily accented Australian slang, or strine language. He injects classic, abrasive larrikin humor, think of a politically incorrect pub joke, into these incredibly dense, rapid-fire rhythmic flows. It creates a sound that is aggressively local, yet technically complex.
Which brings us to part 3, a strict sonic blueprint and mathematical songwriting.
And this brilliantly illustrates what elevates the Rue Digger style beyond just angry rhymes, the underlying architecture. He applies a strict mathematical law to his songwriting, which he calls the 20x3x4 protocol. Every single track must have exactly 3 20-bar verses wrapped around a 4-bar chorus. Furthermore, his rhyme scheme must pivot every 8 bars, and within that 8-bar block, he operates on a strict zero-repeat rule. He outright refuses to reuse the same rhyme word. It showcases a forensic level of vocabulary and prevents his tracks from ever sounding repetitive or lazy. To actually execute this, he deliberately uses a mid-speed flow. He explicitly states that he doesn't want to mumble or blur his words. He views every syllable as a hollow point bullet. The ultimate goal here is absolute clarity in the chaos, ensuring that his target audience, which he frequently refers to as the judge and the jury, can perfectly hear and digest every single piece of evidence he's presenting in his lyrical audit.
All right, part 4, the systemic audit, targets and exposés.
This brings us to the core objective of his music, a self-described systemic audit of the state. And the targets are massive. He wages a relentless lyrical war against federal fusion agencies, specifically the Australian Federal Police and ASIO. He weaves major historical controversies into his tracks, citing the Hope, Howard, and Wood Royal Commissions. He even points his forensic lens at the shadows behind claims regarding the Hilton bombing, Port Arthur, and Bondi. He names specific, highly sensitive players like Witness K and Lawyer X, otherwise known as Informant 3838. His verses are just filled with allegations of deep-rooted corruption,
from officers wiping glitched body cam footage to planting evidence during raids. Now, it's really important to note that we are simply reporting on the claims made in his music, which he presents as undeniable, unfiltered truth.
But the emotional and thematic climax of these audits, it always returns to a highly personal grievance, the Philip Simpson case. In his lyrics, he describes this case as a massive setup involving bought judges and stitched-up files, claiming it's 7 times worse than the speeding case. He uses his verses to vividly paint a picture of a man systematically framed by the authorities, trapped in a cycle of state-sponsored ruin, and he weaves in alleged incidents from Surrey Hills to paint a broader picture of systemic entrapment.
Now for Part 5, the clinical dossier, uncovering the reality.
So, the crucial point is that to fully grasp this explainer, we have to look beyond the booming music and transition to the stark reality found within the clinical dossiers. There is a staggering contrast between the character and the human being. The 6'5" Aussie nationalist god of the microphone is, in reality, Philip James Simpson, a 41-year-old Aboriginal man. While the persona projects the impenetrable strength of a master wordsmith, his clinical files document severe vulnerabilities, including level 3 autism and complex post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from childhood trauma. And while the Rudiger wages a lyrical war against the state, Philip Simpson is the actual target of a joint federal task force known as Operation Avalite Isle.
The reality of his interaction with the justice system is incredibly heavy. The dossiers reveal an extensive forensic history spanning over 100 charges, primarily for things like public nuisance, drug possession, and breaches, which resulted in years of custodial time. He's currently facing severe federal and state charges, including advocating force or violence against groups, and stalking and intimidation. So the conflict isn't just happening in battle rap rings, it's happening right now in courtrooms and holding cells.
However, the clinical dossier presents a very specific counter-narrative to the state's charges. It argues that Philip Simpson is not a terrorist or a criminal mastermind, but a documented survivor of extreme trauma. The perspective presented in these files is that his aggressive musical crimes and online behavior are actually provoked disability responses. The dossier claims that systemic harassment triggered a psychological breakdown, essentially weaponizing his trauma and turning his coping mechanisms into criminal charges. Which leads us to Part 6, Artistic Resistance and Cultural Context.
Let's move to and see how this builds to help us understand how art and trauma collide. We really have to place Filthy's abrasive approach into a recognized historical pattern. Academic sources describe this exact type of music as a form of artistic resistance or outsider criminology. We see it in Western Sydney drill groups like 1-4, who utilize UK drill influences to speak on marginalized experiences, often clashing with police over their lyrics. We see it in Indigenous resistance artists like Briggs and Dobby, who use hip-hop to highlight systemic racism and Royal Commission findings. In this context, the Rudiger persona is the ultimate weaponization of art. A heavy shield built by a traumatized individual to fight back against a system he feels is trying to destroy him.
And through it all, he remains entirely unapologetic to the very end. His tracks frequently close with abrasive larrikin sign-offs, throwing punchlines at cancel culture, the woke left, and what he calls soy sippers and purple-haired galas. By declaring you can't arrest the truth, the persona acts as an impenetrable defense mechanism. It allows him to maintain power and agency, transforming his lived trauma and legal battles into a badge of unyielding defiance.
Which leaves us to ponder this final, highly complex intersection. When we listen to the forensic audits of Filthy, are we hearing a brave whistleblower revealing the dark, hidden truths of a corrupt state apparatus? Or are we witnessing a tragic, real-time documentation of how systemic trauma and the justice system can completely fracture a vulnerable individual, forcing them to build a 6'5" god just to survive? It's a fascinating and sobering question that changes entirely depending on which file you read. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.
From an undisclosed location in Thailand, a 41-year-old man is making a final plea for his life. Fleeing what he describes as state persecution, Philip Simpson is hiding from the Australian government, convinced that returning home is a death sentence. His demand is a specific legal survival mechanism. He is asking authorities to activate Section 1218 AAA of the Social Security Act, a provision that would make his disability support pension indefinitely portable, allowing him to receive his only source of income while remaining in exile. The Australian Federal Police classify Philip as a fugitive. He faces federal charges under the Criminal Code Act for advocating violence and the public display of prohibited Nazi symbols, offenses that carry a maximum of 7 years in prison. The official police threat assessment sits alongside a medical file detailing diagnoses of level 3 autism, severe ADHD, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. He is a man whose daily life is dictated by rigid routine and total state support. Clinical records trace the origins of his CPTSD to a history of profound childhood abuse and documented historical torture during his time in Queensland custody. Curious, this raises a question of how a severely neurodivergent, medically reliant on the state, became the target of a high-level federal prosecution and a fugitive in hiding. Philip's condition often results in a hyper-focus on perceived injustices. Combined with his history of state trauma, this led to a series of online anti-government posts that triggered a national security investigation by the AFP. The ensuing police raids stripped Philip of his primary coping mechanisms. Officers confiscated his prescribed medicinal cannabis and the shirt-making tools a friend had given him, equipment Philip credited with preventing his suicide. Following his arrest, Philip was brought into the interrogation room at the Frankston police station. Interrogation logs show a man in the middle of an acute PTSD crisis. Despite his visible distress and a known prescription, Philip was denied access to his medication throughout the questioning. For an individual with severe autism, this level of sensory and emotional stress often triggers gratuitous concurrence. They may agree with an officer's statements simply to escape the immediate psychological pressure of the interaction. Legal safeguards failed to intervene. The Anungam laws require Aboriginal suspects to have an active support person present, but Philip's state-provided independent third person remained silent, even as Philip stated his brain wasn't working and that he didn't understand the questions. The resulting police record became a catalog of statements made by a man in the middle of a documented psychiatric breakdown. After his release on bail, Philip fled to Thailand. He viewed the move as a desperate survival mechanism to escape the law enforcement pressure he felt was closing in on him. While he was abroad, Services Australia cancelled his disability support pension. Freedom of Information documents obtained by his defense team suggest this was an administrative move to pressure Philip into returning to Australia by cutting off his ability to buy food or housing. The financial pressure forced Philip to return. Upon landing, police intercepted him and seized his passport. In the bail hearing, the prosecution opposed Philip's release by claiming his travel history was unknown. They maintained this position while physically holding his passport, which contained the very Thai entry stamps they claimed they couldn't verify. Philip's situation was the result of border control, welfare denial, and court misrepresentation, all occurring simultaneously. Philip is now back before the Melbourne Magistrates Court. He faces a complex federal trial that will require him to navigate a legal system he is medically unequipped to understand. He is currently attempting to manage 3 separate legal and administrative battles at once: a federal criminal defense, a bail appeal, and a fight with Centrelink for his basic pension. His ultimate strategy is to petition for a permanent stay of proceedings. He is asking the court to stop the trial entirely, citing state misconduct, entrapment, and an abuse of the legal process. The laws used in this case were designed to break up organized criminal networks. Those blunt force protocols are proving to be fundamentally incompatible with a defendant who has level 3 autism and severe trauma. When a system built for high-level security threats is applied to a disabled individual, the result isn't a resolution of the charges, it is the total devastation of the person. Inside a sparsely furnished room in Victoria, Philip Simpson spends his days entirely isolated. His mental capacity to navigate the outside world is collapsing. This medical assessment outlines a severe clinical profile. Philip requires high-level support for level 3 autism, agoraphobia, and complex PTSD. He also lives with a constant, absolute conviction. He believes the Australian government and local police force are actively hunting him. Records from his youth document a history of trauma, from childhood abuse by a priest to physical beatings at school. More recently, his clinical files include allegations of police torture, describing an incident where he was shackled and injected while paralyzed. On paper, Philip's fear of state surveillance presents as the tragic paranoia of a broken mind, a textbook case of a patient struggling to separate historical trauma from his present reality. This advocacy letter from Philip's support coordinator states his National Disability Insurance Scheme funding, a $16,000 allocation, is insufficient to meet immediate needs. The shortfall creates undue stress, compromising his mental health and capacity to live independently. Philip's legal filings now include a forensic paper trail that documents specific government interactions aligning with the events he previously described. These internal logs and court documents shift the focus from his clinical diagnosis to actual circumstances. They provide a documented record of state actions that correlate with his claims of systemic harassment. In mid-2025, Philip fled to Thailand, attempting to escape what he perceived as ongoing harassment by the authorities. This FOI log shows Services Australia scheduled a job capacity assessment while Philip was abroad, despite knowing he had left. When he missed it, his pension was suspended. The log explicitly states his only option for reinstatement was to return to Australia. For a profoundly disabled man isolated overseas, the loss of his sole source of income created an immediate crisis, what his support team categorized as a threat to his life. Refusing to reschedule ensured he would lose his means of survival, creating a financial mechanism that forced him back into the jurisdiction of the police. Philip returned to Melbourne in August. Upon his arrival, the legal system immediately restricted his movements. Bail conditions required him to report to Cranbourne Police Station 3 times weekly. This letter from Dr. Daly warns his PTSD makes waiting in queues impossible, inducing acute panic. The conditions forced him into the exact environment guaranteed to cause psychiatric distress. Shortly after, police conducted a raid on Philip's residence. During the search, officers seized property Philip used for mental health stability, including suicide prevention tools, without providing a receipt or record of the seizure. By stripping away his financial independence, removing his psychological coping mechanisms, and mandating his presence in triggering environments, the state effectively neutralized Philip's ability to defend himself. Philip's defense has now escalated the case to the Supreme Court of Victoria, challenging the foundational legality of the prosecution. They argue a fusion doctrine, NDIS, welfare agencies, and police colluding to target a single individual. The core is an illegal data breach. The defense claims authorities bypassed standard warrants to access Philip's private data, meaning all subsequent evidence is tainted. If successful, the defense seeks a permanent stay of proceedings, declaring the entire prosecution a nullity based on an abuse of process. The case questions whether the state utilized social welfare data to conduct a backdoor surveillance operation that bypasses traditional legal protections. The compounding weight of financial starvation, constant police reporting, and escalating legal battles has pushed Philip to a point of total psychological exhaustion. His defense calls this administrative gaslighting, a condition where a disabled individual is hollowed out by the very systems meant to support them. The final argument is that the administrative architecture of the welfare state was used as the primary weapon.
All right, let's get straight into it. Today, we're not just looking at a standard legal case. We are opening up a sprawling, deeply unsettling forensic dossier. Now, the source documents we're about to analyze in this explainer, they read exactly like a gritty psychological thriller, but they detail very real, heavily documented events. We're calling this the anatomy of a breakdown, the state versus Philip Simpson. We're going to conduct a full, unflinching evaluation of the state's machinery and look at what happens when an incredibly vulnerable individual allegedly becomes the target of a massive, multi-agency operation.
To really understand the stakes here, I want to drop you directly into the visceral chaos of an interrogation room at the Hastings Police Station on September 10, 2025. Just listen to this desperate plea pulled right from the raw transcript. "I think my mental health is too far gone. I can't even keep my eyes open. My mental health is very, very bad, and I'm very, very scared." You know, this isn't just a suspect dodging questions. The defense heavily argues that this is a documented medical collapse happening in real time, right under the watch of law enforcement. What we're unraveling today, purely through the lens of these curated legal, medical, and administrative documents, is a core conflict of staggering proportions. On one side, you have a man with severe neurodevelopmental challenges and complex trauma, and on the other, an alleged, relentless bureaucratic nightmare involving the police, border force, and social services. It's a high-stakes legal battle centered entirely around accusations of systemic entrapment and the absolute weaponization of a person's disability.
Okay, let's dive into this timeline, starting with that harrowing September arrest. To understand the catalyst for this whole legal battle, we have to look at what went down that specific day. The defense's master legal brief paints a deeply disturbing picture of the interrogation. Simpson was detained for 6 hours, and the brief alleges he was completely denied basic needs, including vital medication and water. But honestly, what's truly startling is the transcript detailing the independent third person, or the ITP. This is someone who is literally supposed to be there to protect the rights of a vulnerable suspect. Well, according to the audio logs, this ITP was caught on a hot mic whispering to Simpson, trying to coordinate a cover story favorable to the police and actively overriding his attempts to just invoke his right to silence. All while officers allegedly just ignored his direct statements of complete mental collapse.
Now, to grasp why that interrogation room environment was so catastrophic, we have to uncover the clinical reality behind his breakdown.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what was going on beneath the surface. It's a specialist mind care psychiatric report, and it lays out the objective medical reality of the situation. We're not talking about a legal argument here. It's a hard clinical diagnosis. It unequivocally confirms that Simpson suffers from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. The report details profound trauma responses, an exaggerated startle response, severe hypervigilance, and emotional shutdown. This was the baseline reality of the man sitting in that interrogation room. Furthermore, the records confirm diagnoses of level 3 autism right alongside his CPTSD. To put that into perspective, level 3 is the absolute highest support category for autism, which indicates severe neurodevelopmental challenges. When you combine that with CPTSD, you have an individual characterized by intense hypervigilance, severe emotional dysregulation, and just an extreme vulnerability to systemic stress and authority figures. The defense alleges that it is precisely these documented vulnerabilities that were weaponized against him by the state machinery.
And the paper trail documenting this vulnerability is extensive. Take a look at this display case note from earlier in 2025, documenting a suicide risk assessment. It explicitly details his paranoia, his deep fear of being watched and mistreated by police, and his desperate plans to seek safety by just moving to Thailand. So the authorities were absolutely aware of his fragile state. It was meticulously logged in their own administrative systems long before that September arrest.
So, you've got to ask, where did this intense institutional care actually come from?
Why is a man with level 3 autism so utterly terrified of the police? Well, the defense points to a 2021 hospital event as the original sin of this entire saga. The origin of his CPTSD is detailed in a chilling statement from Simpson's own NDIS support worker. The statement reads, 3 police officers armed with submachine guns arrested him, forced to remain in the bed to urinate and defecate as the officers refused to unlock the restraints. This isn't just an accusation of minor mistreatment, right? It is a claim of severe, degrading, state-sanctioned physical and psychological torture.
Let's methodically break down the brutal elements of that 2021 event as detailed in the advocate's statement. Simpson was reportedly shackled and handcuffed to a public hospital bed for 9 straight days. 9 days. He was guarded continuously by tactical police holding assault weapons, sometimes allegedly pointed right at his head. He suffered extreme sleep and nutritional deprivation due to the absolute terror of the situation. And the alleged reason for this massive counter-terrorism level mobilization? According to the documents, it was a wildly disproportionate retaliation for satirical dark humor videos he posted online that offended local police. This event right here is the documented genesis of his severe PTSD.
Let's move on and see how this builds into what the defense describes as a massive bureaucratic trap.
They allege that the trauma of 2021 laid the groundwork for an incredibly coordinated, multi-agency entrapment operation. Watch how this timeline allegedly plays out to create a financial entrapment narrative. In May 2025, while Simpson was seeking peace overseas, his disability support pension, which is literally his sole source of income, was abruptly canceled, placing him under immense financial duress. Out of money, he voluntarily returns to Australia in late August. On September 10th, he is ambushed and arrested. Then, exactly 1 day later, on September 11th, his pension is miraculously manually reinstated with over $8,300 in back pay. The defense argues this was a mathematically deterministic honeypot operation, cut off his funds to force him back into the jurisdiction just so he could be arrested.
And then there's the arrest warrant itself, which is heavily contested. Just look at this stark comparison. To secure the warrant, the police claimed to the magistrate that Simpson was a high flight risk who was openly speaking about escaping apprehension. But the documented reality? Simpson had voluntarily returned to Australia through airport customs 9 days prior to the warrant even being issued. The defense highlights this as a massive material non-disclosure to the court, arguing the warrant was obtained on entirely false grounds. But honestly, how did the police know exactly where to ambush him on September 10th? The legal briefs allege a chilling privacy breach. They claim law enforcement unlawfully weaponized Simpson's highly private NDIS medical file. By allegedly using a warrantless backdoor connection to his disability support coordinator, police bypass standard legal protocols to actively track the location of an autistic man.
All right, so with all these serious charges, how do you even begin to fight back?
While Simpson's response is an aggressive forensic defense strategy aimed entirely at dismantling the state's procedural conduct, and they're doing it by relying heavily on the state's own paper trail. Take a look at this Leap Victoria Police criminal record document. It visually emphasizes the relentless, continuous motif of this whole case. An individual placed under a microscope, systematically tracked, and monitored across multiple government databases, reinforcing the narrative of an institutional obsession rather than just routine law enforcement.
So the crucial point is how the master defense brief uses all this data to claim fatal procedural defects, moving for a permanent stay of proceedings based on 4 massive pillars. First, jurisdictional nullity. They argue the online acts occurred while he was physically in Vietnam, so completely outside Australian jurisdiction. Second, evidence spoliation. Forensic analysis allegedly shows tampered federal interview audio with a staggering 21 missing minutes. Third, misfeasance in public office, claiming agencies illegally coordinated to retaliate against him for whistleblowing. And finally, trespass, arguing the original raid was executed using a civil debt warrant illegally disguised as a criminal search warrant.
The documentation we've gone through in this explainer leaves us with a profound and honestly a deeply unsettling question. When the full weight of the state's machinery, police, border force, disability services, and welfare agencies, is allegedly coordinated and weaponized against a severely disabled, traumatized individual, at what point does the justice system itself become the abuser? It's something we definitely need to think about.
I'm begging you. Get sad, get angry, and save me. Don't let them win. Now, that doesn't sound like a line from a dry legal document, does it? But it is. That is a desperate, documented plea from a man named Philip Simpson, officially logged in a government form right before he fled Australia for Thailand. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we've got a highly complex, deeply unsettling case to unpack. We're looking at a man who is claiming, through a mountain of legal and medical documentation, that he's the victim of state-sanctioned entrapment and just profound psychological torment. So what we're doing today is an unflinching, totally impartial forensic deconstruction of Philip Simpson's reality. We are relying strictly on the master litigation briefs, internal police logs, government case notes, and forensic psychiatric evaluations. We're going to piece together exactly what's going on here, because these source documents allege a massive systemic breakdown, and we're going to follow the paper trail to see exactly how those claims are built from the ground up. Part 1. The clinical mind. To really wrap our heads around the sheer stakes of this situation, we first have to understand the mind of the man at the center of it all. We have a primary source document here. It's a letter from Maurice Blackburn lawyers detailing an extensive psychological report by Dr. Elnicky Brand. Now, this isn't some self-diagnosis or internet conjecture, right? This is a formal, documented psychiatric evaluation outlining an absolutely immense psychological load. And the legal defense briefs hinge entirely on the fact that the state was fully aware of these exact vulnerabilities.
The absolutely crucial point here is the compounding nature of this clinical load. We're talking about level 3 autism spectrum disorder, which heavily impacts communication and social processing. Now combine that with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline and antisocial personality disorders, ADHD, and a polysubstance use disorder. It's a lot, right? According to the defense briefs, this specific combination creates an incredibly vulnerable individual. Their core argument is that when law enforcement engages with someone carrying this specific neurological profile, standard police procedures can easily and very quickly turn into catastrophic psychological triggers.
Part 2. The catalyst of torment. So you have to ask, where does a psychological load of that magnitude even come from? Well, according to the master litigation briefs and witness statements, there's a very specific inciting trauma that serves as the genesis for his debilitating complex PTSD. 9. It's a really harrowing number when you understand the context. According to an official statement provided to the County Court of Victoria by Philip's NDIS support worker, 9 is the number of days Philip Simpson was shackled to a public hospital bed under armed police guard.
Let me just read you this chilling detail straight from his NDIS advocate's official statement. Quote, refusing to unlock the shackles so he could stand up to take a shower, urinate, or defecate, end quote. We are looking at a documented claim of state-sanctioned torture. And according to the brief, this was allegedly retaliation over some satirical or dark humor videos that Philip posted online which offended the police. This severe trauma is exactly what his lawyers argue set the stage for every single thing that followed. Part 3. The systemic vice. From that point of deep, deep trauma, the defense lays out what they describe as a mathematically deterministic sequence of multi-agency coordination. Basically, they're alleging a deliberate administrative trap. Just walk through this exact timeline with me for a second, straight from the forensic audit brief. On May 21st, 2025, while Philip is overseas, his disability support pension is canceled. This puts him under extreme financial duress, so he voluntarily returns to Australia on August 27th. Then on September 10th, he's tracked down and arrested in a park. And here is the kicker. Exactly 1 day later, on September 11th, his pension is manually reinstated with over $8,300 in back pay. The defense argues this was literally a honeypot operation, essentially weaponizing his vital disability income to lure him back to the country and verify his address for law enforcement. But guys, the contradictions here go even deeper. To secure the warrants and deny him bail, the prosecution claimed Philip posed a violent threat and was a high flight risk. Yet, if you look at the police's own internal situation reports, the SITREPs, they say the exact opposite. SITREP 4 literally states he did not feel like a threat at all. The AFP logs show they knew he voluntarily returned to Australia, which totally contradicts the flight risk claim. And the arresting officer's own notes describe him not as aggressive, but as calm, but kept saying he is scared. The official documents are literally fighting each other. Part 4. The collapse. This all brings us straight into the interrogation room on September 10th, 2025. And here, we aren't just looking at legal maneuvering anymore. We are witnessing the documented, real-time cognitive collapse of a neurodivergent mind in police custody. This quote is verbatim from the interrogation transcript. Philip tells the officers, "I think my mental health is too far gone. I can't even keep my eyes open. I'm very, very scared." Even with these overt declarations of being medically unfit, the interrogation just kept going. And what's truly wild is that the internal police logs actually confirm he was telling the truth about his total exhaustion. The notes show he literally fell asleep just 7 minutes after this intense questioning finally ended. Now, what is deeply, deeply concerning here is the role of the independent third person, or the ITP. By law, an ITP is required to be present to safeguard the rights of a vulnerable, neurodivergent person. But the audio transcripts caught the ITP on a hot mic whispering this to Philip. Again, cut in. Philip, do we agree that Val's called you after did a welfare check? The defense audit alleges that this is the independent safeguard, the person meant to protect him, actively feeding the suspect a coordinated cover story. And honestly, it gets worse. When Philip is asked if he understands his rights, his impaired, totally nonsensical response is just no comment and comment. He's clearly not tracking. But instead of stopping the interview to assess his cognitive state, the independent third person intervenes and firmly states, based on previous experience, I believe Philip understands the caution. The legal defense brief categorizes this as a severe breach of interrogation rules. It's known as gratuitous concurrence, where the safeguard actively steamrolls over the impaired suspect just to keep the prosecution moving forward. Part 5. Total isolation. So, what is the ultimate result of all this? The compounding clinical load, the alleged financial entrapment, and the complete collapse during interrogation. We're looking at a man who has been legally and psychologically driven to the very edge of the abyss, which brings us right back to the document we started with. This is an official Centerlink case note from April 2025. The government's own social worker logs that Philip feels he cannot be safe in Australia, feels he's being constantly watched and mistreated by police, and is desperately trying to secure his pension portability so he can flee to Thailand. This document is absolute, undeniable proof of his deep isolation, paranoia, and sheer despair, recorded directly into the government's own database. Which leaves us with this final, really haunting question. We've gone through the forensic briefs, the psychiatric evaluations, the alleged procedural breaches, and the profound human toll. So what actually happens when a fractured, neurodivergent mind gets caught in what appears to be an inescapable, mathematically deterministic systemic loop? The documents clearly lay out the anatomy of a breakdown,
but it's really up to us to reflect on the gravity of what that actually means for the human being trapped inside of it.
Imagine, if you will, a sprawling, complex legal battle that reads way less like your standard court case and a lot more like a dark psychological thriller. That's exactly what we're looking at today. In this explainer, we're diving deep into the Crown prosecuting a man named Philip James Simpson. But as we start peeling back the layers, looking at the court transcripts, the forensic audits, the raw evidentiary documents, it becomes incredibly clear that we aren't just looking at the trial of one man. We are potentially looking at a trial of the legal and administrative system itself.
Right out of the gate, the defense's master litigation brief drops an absolute bombshell. They argue that this entire prosecution stems from what they call a poisoned root, specifically an illegal backdoor data breach. Think about that for a second. They aren't just contesting the charges against Simpson, they're alleging systemic judicial bias and total procedural lawlessness. The defense is essentially standing up and saying, look, the state literally broke the law in order to enforce the law.
To really grasp the gravity of this, you have to picture the setting. Chief Justice Marilyn Warren once described the Victorian Supreme Court as a hushed space where the law listens and speaks. She noted that very few people are not intimidated by its sheer power, and that paints such a brilliant contrast, doesn't it? On one side, you have this grand, Gothic, deeply traditional architecture of the Supreme Court, and colliding right into it is the invisible, chaotic, highly contested world of modern digital surveillance that dragged the accused into that very room. Section 1. The stage and the accused.
Okay, we've got to look at both sides of this objectively to really set the stage. If we look at things purely from the Crown's perspective, they point straight to official police records from both Queensland and Victoria. They see a long documented history across 2 different states. We're talking about charges that range from public nuisance and obstructing police, all the way up to intimidation of a law enforcement officer and intentionally displaying a Nazi symbol. So to the Crown, the narrative is straightforward. This establishes the accused as a clear, documented risk to public safety.
Section 2. The interrogation transcripts.
Picture this. We are stepping into a tiny, claustrophobic interview room at the Frankston Police Station. It's October 18th, 2024. Detective Senior Constable Ryan Hopkins sits down across from Philip Simpson. Now, ostensibly, this formal interrogation is about the offense of incitement related to some online profiles, specifically a Telegram channel. But even just reading the transcript, the tension is absolutely palpable.
In the actual transcript of the interview, the tone gets unbelievably unpredictable from literally the first minute. At 10:12 a.m., Detective Hopkins asks, just for the purpose of the interview, if calling him Phil is fine. Simpson casually fires back with a highly offensive racial slur, telling the detective he can call him, quote, Rue N-word if he wants. The detective just sort of laughs it off, says he'll stick with Phil, and pushes forward. But right away, you know you're looking at an interrogation that is completely derailed from standard procedure.
But Simpson's core defense actually emerges clearly in that exact same transcript. He states, flat out, everything I do is of comedic purposes. He's arguing that his private 18-plus Telegram channel, which was called Filthy, was completely dedicated to dark humor and satire. From his perspective, what amounted to a $50 Australian joke or a 1,000 baht joke is being heavily twisted. He claims authorities are relying on heuristic reasoning and tired terrorism stereotypes to paint him as a genuine extremist.
Now here is where the procedural thriller really deepens. During these interviews, there's a designated advocate present, an independent third person, or ITP, named Mike Bennett. But according to the defense's forensic legal report, Bennett allegedly just sat there in total silence, even as Simpson started showing signs of severe distress, what the defense acoustically describes as psychomotor retardation, and a literal collapse of his vowel space. His advocate allegedly didn't say a word. The defense claims this massive failure violates his right to silence and entirely invalidates any admissions made.
Section 3. Tracking in the trap.
If you thought the interrogation was tense, the events leading up to the actual arrest play out like a full-blown spy novel. The defense alleges this was a massive, highly coordinated government trap. Check out this timeline from their forensic audit. In May 2025, Simpson's National Disability Insurance Scheme file gets mysteriously flagged. Come August, while he happens to be overseas, his disability support pension is suddenly completely canceled. By September, a specific Centrelink call is scheduled, and here is the absolute kicker. He is apprehended at the exact time and physical location of that scheduled call. The defense is literally arguing that the state weaponized his welfare just to force him back onto Australian soil. The defense actually crunched the math on this. They argue that the probability of 7 completely separate government agencies somehow randomly coordinating his pension cancellation with his simultaneous arrest is less than 0.0001%. To them, it's not a coincidence, it is a mathematical impossibility, pointing directly to coordinated misfeasance.
Section 4, the fusion doctrine defense. This fusion doctrine is essentially the defense's massive counterattack, demanding a permanent stay of proceedings based on an abusive process. They put together a master forensic audit comparing what the Crown swore to versus what the documents actually show, and there are glaring inconsistencies. Simple things like differing spellings of his own name. But more importantly, the Crown claimed he was an offshore flight risk, while the defense pulled Australian Federal Police movement records proving he was already onshore. The Crown claims his motive is right-wing extremism. The defense counters that the real motive is retaliation because Simpson has a documented history of making protected disclosures against the police. And the allegations of evidence tampering, they are absolutely staggering. The defense lists a rapid-fire series of nightmares. The use of warrantless spyware to break into his private telegram, weird triplicate loops and unexplained glitch noises all over the interrogation audio, totally missing video evidence, PKF editing files that suggest someone manipulated the audio recordings, and the seizure of suicide prevention tools, which Simpson referred to as a hobby without ever providing a receipt. It's a laundry list of alleged procedural chaos.
Section 5. Echoes of Past Trauma.
We need to slow down for a second here, because to even begin to understand Simpson's current state of mind and his highly erratic reactions to law enforcement, we have to look back at his psychological origins. There is this haunting account from an NDIS support worker who acted as Simpson's advocate. They detail an alleged incident in Queensland 4 years ago, stating that Simpson was handcuffed and shackled to a hospital bed for 9 straight days just for posting satire videos. The worker claims officers refused to unlock the shackles even for basic human necessities like showering or using the bathroom, describing the ordeal as state-sanctioned torture and intentional degradation.
And this isn't just a story. The NDIS support worker actually signed a document attesting to this abuse. The defense connects this past trauma directly to the current case. They argue that this severe, horrific degradation allegedly caused Simpson's complex PTSD. In their eyes, he isn't just a defendant, he's a survivor of documented state-level trauma, which fundamentally changes how his brain processes any interaction with the police today. And finally, Section 6, the Supreme Court cliffhanger. All of this, the procedural anomalies, the surveillance, the deep-seated trauma, converges on a current bail variation application before the Supreme Court. Here, the defense drops what they literally call a kill shot piece of evidence. It's a medical letter from Dr. Mark Daly of First People's Health. Dr. Daly states explicitly that because of his complex PTSD, Simpson absolutely cannot, quote, hang around waiting in queues at a police station. Doing so induces severe panic and verbal outbursts. So the defense argues that forcing him to report to police is actually a medical impossibility, one that actively triggers the exact erratic behavior the court is trying so hard to prevent. Which means we've hit complete, absolute deadlock. On one side, you have the Crown insisting he is a terror and flight risk, who absolutely must report to the police and have his passport taken away. On the other side, the defense argues the reporting condition is a medical impossibility that's causing him systemic trauma. Oh, and as for being a flight risk, they point out that the state is currently prosecuting him for attempting to flee, while the Australian Federal Police are the ones literally holding his passport. Which leaves us right here, on the edge of our seats, with one massive, lingering question. When a defendant's medical survival fundamentally contradicts the state's rigid mandate for surveillance, how does the Supreme Court possibly balance those scales of justice? What actually happens when the legal system itself becomes the primary suspect in an abuse of power? I'll leave you to ponder that one. Keep questioning the details, and we'll see you next time.
Imagine, for a second, a legal thriller where the defense's absolute strongest weapon isn't some airtight alibi, but the government's very own paperwork. The prosecution relies on state collusion. This is an abusive process. Now, that's not a dramatic line from a Hollywood script. That is a direct quote from a real, incredibly high-stakes legal defense strategy that we're going to be breaking down today.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are taking a deep dive into the anatomy of a defense in the highly complex case of R versus Philip James Simpson. We're going to explore exactly how a defense team systematically attempts to dismantle the Crown's case, literally piece by piece, using the state's own administrative evidence and procedural missteps right against them. Let's just jump right into it.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the Crown's case. Before we can really appreciate how the defense tears this whole thing apart, we've first got to understand the formidable narrative and the massive obstacles the prosecution originally laid out. So to understand the defense, we need to look at the accused, Philip James Simpson. He's a registered Aboriginal man diagnosed with level 3 autism and complex PTSD. And he was facing a whole raft of both federal and state charges. Now, to secure his detention and those really strict bail conditions, the police labeled him a flight risk and actually seized his passport to prevent any international travel. So the government is presenting this massive, overwhelming weight against a highly vulnerable subject. You could feel the tension right from the start, right?
Which brings us to Section 2, the flight risk lie.
Okay, here is where we hit our first major plot twist. The defense doesn't just, deny the charges. They go completely on the offensive against the sworn statements of the police. Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast. The prosecution opposed bail by claiming Simpson was a flight risk with unknown whereabouts, basically suggesting he was elusive or hiding offshore somewhere. But then, the defense counters with Exhibit MPS 02, which actually proves he arrived on shore, voluntarily, on August 27th. The defense is boldly juxtaposing police testimony right against the police's very own hard documentary evidence.
Let's look a little closer at Exhibit MPS 02, or what the defense is calling the smoking gun. These are the official Australian Federal Police movement records. They explicitly list an arrival date of August 27, 2025 at Sydney Airport, completely confirming his status was on shore. And the absolutely shocking detail here? Well, police seized his passport on September 10th. The defense argues they held that passport, complete with entry stamps, for over 100 days, all while simultaneously telling the court that his travel history was unknown and that he was a flight risk. I mean, wow.
Moving right along to Section 3, the oppressive interrogation.
Let's completely shift our focus to the exact day of his arrest, September 10, 2025, and dissect the heavily disputed record of interview. This forms the absolute core of the Crown's evidence. What we're dealing with here is a formal privacy complaint detailing alleged coercion by Australian Border Force agents at Sydney Airport on August 26th. The defense uses this to highlight the extreme pressure applied right at the border. According to the complaint, border agents actually threatened Simpson with immediate imprisonment just to force him to unlock his phone, without a judicial order, mind you. This really sets the stage. It shows a suspect who is already deeply distressed before the formal police interview even begins.
Then comes the police interview itself. The defense pulls 3 specific, highly critical moments from the transcript to really visualize the mounting distress of an autistic suspect. The first one is simply, "I'm scared." Those were Simpson's exact words the moment the intense interrogation commenced.
Next comes a stark, one-word refusal, no. This was Simpson's direct attempt to terminate the questioning when he was asked if he was well enough to continue.
And finally, this desperate plea, "My mental health is no good." The defense argues that despite these incredibly explicit statements from a diagnosed level 3 autistic man suffering from complex PTSD, the investigating officials completely ignored him. They just continued the interrogation and, according to the claims, even denied him his prescribed medication.
So the crucial point is, legally speaking, this all comes down to Section 84 of the Evidence Act regarding oppression. Under this specific section, oppression involves conduct that infringes on a suspect's fundamental liberty. The defense argues that by completely ignoring those 3 explicit pleas to stop and denying medical care, the police engaged in deeply oppressive conduct. And legally, that poisons the Crown's evidence, making any admissions obtained during that interview absolutely inadmissible in court.
The escalation is officially documented in a Commonwealth Ombudsman complaint. It outlines serious allegations of state-sanctioned torture and, again, the ignored requests to stop the interview. The defense is submitting that the police conduct wasn't just some minor procedural error, but an extreme, fundamental violation of a vulnerable person's rights.
Okay, let's dive into this next part. Section 4, the administrative trap.
This is where the defense alleges interagency collusion to literally manufacture the arrest. Let's just walk through this Centrelink timeline chronologically. So, in April 2025, Simpson departs Australia for Thailand for mental health treatment, which he had explicitly notified the agency about. On May 15th, an impossible in-person assessment is scheduled back in Australia. Obviously, he can't make it, so by May 21st, his disability pension is canceled for non-compliance. Then, fast forward, he's arrested on shore on September 10th while waiting for a Centrelink phone call.
The very next day, September 11th, his pension is suddenly reinstated. The defense maps all this out to show how Centrelink allegedly engineered a massive financial crisis just to force his return to Australia directly into the waiting hands of the police.
And look at this number right here, $8,400. That is the full back pay mysteriously reinstated to his pension account just 24 hours after he was safely in police custody. The defense raises a huge question here. Was that initial cancellation just an administrative mistake, or was it a tactical, calculated lure?
This whole timeline builds up to something called a Public Interest Certificate, or a PIC. This was issued on September 9, 2025, literally the day before his arrest. Normally, accessing protected NDIS and Centrelink location data requires a strict warrant and judicial oversight. But the defense claims this certificate used a completely manufactured threat-to-life pretext to release that highly sensitive data directly to Victoria Police. This administrative maneuver allegedly bypassed standard privacy protections entirely, essentially acting as a backdoor to track him down using his own disability support system.
Which brings us to our final act. Section 5, the ultimate kill switch.
This is the climax of it all, the absolute master legal strategy. Here is the abusive process inventory. The defense systematically weaponizes the state's own alleged misconduct right back at them. They cite passport perjury to manufacture a flight risk, the Centrelink trap and unlawful data sharing, the incredibly oppressive interrogation of a vulnerable person, and of course the coerced digital evidence at the border. All of this culminates in one single, incredibly powerful legal maneuver, an application for a permanent stay of proceedings, the kill switch. They aren't just fighting these charges in court, they are demanding a total dismissal, because as they argued, the process itself is irreparably tainted.
And here is the truly surprising twist to this massive state effort, the collapsing case. The primary, arguably most serious charge of inciting hatred has officially been withdrawn. What's left are only minor charges regarding conduct that the police's own transcripts admit actually occurred outside Australian jurisdiction over in Thailand. So after all the resources spent and all the interagency efforts, the Crown's case is fundamentally fractured.
Which leaves us with an incredibly heavy, overarching question to ponder. When the state breaks its own rules to secure a win, does the integrity of the justice system actually survive? It's a highly provocative thought, and honestly exactly why dissecting the mechanics of a complex legal defense like this is just so fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning what you see.